Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Battlefield, Pennsylvania. Today we're on location at Fort McCord, Franklin County. In 1756, Indian warriors attacked Pennsylvania settlers here at McCord's fort. Days later, the two sides met again at the Battle of Sideling Hill. I'm your host, Brady Crytzer. Joining me today to discuss the battles of Fort McCord and Sideling Hill are historian Andrew Newman and Juniata archaeologist Jonathan Burns. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Andrew, you're a second-time guest. Remind us a little bit about your background.
Hi Brady, my name's Andrew Newman. I live in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania here. Currently I work for the Army, but my past, I was at Gettysburg National Military Park, and before that I worked at the National Baseball Hall of Fame, and for graduate school I went to the University of Pittsburgh. The history in this area is something that's really dear to my heart, especially places like Fort McCord, where you can really go and really feel the 1750s. It's a very exciting place.
John?
I'm an archaeologist at Juniata College, and I got into exploring the archaeology of the French and Indian War here in central Pennsylvania because we're right in the midst of it. So I started doing some archaeology field schools at Fort Shirley, and it kind of blossomed into working on other forts like Fort Littleton and looking at roads on the Forbes Road forts, as well as fortifications that went along with anything between 1754 to 1758 really is the archaeological slice of time that I'm interested in, tracking material culture kind of across the frontier.
It's a beautiful day. We're in this wonderful, quiet area. It hasn't changed much since the 1750s. So what was life like here in the 1750s?
In the 1750s, in this valley, some refer to as the Great Valley, the Cumberland Valley. Today it's Franklin County. Back in the 1740s, 50s, it was part of Cumberland County. And it was an area where most of the settlers that were coming here were new to the colony of Pennsylvania and settling in what we've referred to as the backcountry, and building farming land that, for the most part, historically was fairly cleared. But as apart from where they wanted to be, most of them Scots-Irish, they didn't want to be near Philadelphia, or they wanted to stay away from your what you would refer to as government oversight, and so they saw the backcountry of Pennsylvania as where we are today in Fort McCord, just east of the Alleghenies, part of the Appalachian Mountain chain, as a really wonderful spot for them to farm and live life in an area that, up to that point in the 1750s, was relatively safe.
John, if you were a recent immigrant and you had this vast country that you could settle, what would you bring with you? How would you tame a place like this?
Well, if you're a settler, you're functionally trying to claim land for the empire. They need people living on the frontier, essentially, and farming and making a go of it. So you would need blacksmithing skills, your farming skills, and also some knowledge of the Native Americans, the indigenous population that you're going to be overlapping with in your activities if you're going to go that far out into the frontier.
You mentioned that they were trying to move away from Philadelphia. There's a tense relationship there. Could we talk about the relationship between the frontiersmen, the recent immigrants, and the established people of Philadelphia?
Well, in the time in the 1740s and 50s, in Philadelphia, for an example, there was a feeling of, you could say, cultural bias towards the Scots-Irish, these new immigrants that were coming over. They wanted them to colonize and settle in Pennsylvania, but not necessarily in Philadelphia. And they were very happy with them settling in the backcountry, such as we have here at Fort McCord, because even though up to that point this area, Pennsylvania as a colony, was safe, considering the French being just over the on the other side of present-day Pittsburgh, it was considered to be a safe area. But with Empire, they were nervous about French incursion.
John, when we drive through here, we see farms today, but you might see this differently. What would you expect to find during an archaeological survey to indicate that people used to live here in the 1750s?
So they would have been farmsteaders, essentially, and many of the fortifications that we know as settlers' forts would have been just a very heavy log structure, maybe with some rifle slats and access to water. A good spot for a cabin, but then they would have fortified it. So when I'm looking for an archaeological site that dates to this time period, I want to find first the cloud of artifacts that would relate back to that time period: the buttons, the lead balls, the gun parts, anything that that'll clue us into 1754 to 1756, especially if you're looking for the buttons from militia or just settlers. You can get a lot of information from this because they're not standardized. You're seeing like different walks of life, different socioeconomic statuses. So there's lots to glean from the material culture that we can't necessarily get from the written record, and they really work in tandem to inform one another. So I would come out here and look for those artifacts. Once I thought I saw enough clustering, then you have to dig and sort through the soil, looking for more artifacts, but more importantly, looking for foundations or trenches that would have held the palisade logs, for instance. And since we know that there was a fire with the attack here, there would be evidence of charred logs. And it's only 250 years ago, isn't that long ago archaeologically. And the plow zone here, yes, the land has been farmed ever since then, but you really only lose maybe 8 to 10 inches of stratigraphically intact soil, but it's still being mixed around, and the artifacts are still generally where they belong. But once you get below that, you can find the foundations, the palisade trenches, the fire hearth, cooking features, latrines.
People have lived here for thousands of years. I'm sure you're finding evidence from previous cultures as well.
Definitely. When we were doing a short field school around the backside of the barn here, we found a couple projectile points that we know date to the late Archaic period, like 4,000 years ago. So obviously people have been keying in on the springs here, and they weren't even farming at that point. They were hunter-gatherers, but there was a rich environment here to capitalize on that focused their occupations as well.
We can feel very isolated where we are, but the 7 Years' War, which is the event we'll be dealing with in context, is a global event. What brought about the 7 Years' War here in North America?
Well, it was a struggle for empire from mainly the Franco and the Anglo perspectives. You have the British colonies that are looking to expand. You have French possessions that are looking to expand, and this all comes together in the area of what we refer to as the Ohio country, concentrating on the force at the Ohio, and how it really ignites and sets off is that you have a fella who is known throughout history, or particularly American history, George Washington, who gets involved in this, and by expanding the efforts of the colony of Virginia with trying to occupy and acquire the land at the force of the Ohio. And with that came a disastrous result, Jumonville Glen, the surprise attack on the French and their diplomat. Then you have Fort Necessity, disaster. Washington failed in that attempt in 1754, and then you have the French building a Fort Duquesne at the force of the Ohio, and ultimately the British response was to send a large army under the command of General Edward Braddock to eliminate Fort Duquesne, and ended up meeting failure as well at the Battle of Monongahela in 1755. And and that really paved the way for the Indian incursions into Pennsylvania, and especially this area in south central PA.
We mentioned the British and the French, but the Indians. Who were the Indian nations involved in this event in this area?
From my perspective, following George Crowan around from, he was all the way out in the Ohio country stirring up trade and basically undercutting French trade with the Ohio natives. A couple reasons were that the French traders were cut off from their supplies, from naval blockades, and also from trouble up in Canada. So the English traders had much better access to goods and could give the Native Americans better deals. So they were all kind of orbiting closer to the British, specifically George Crowan, who was all the way out in the middle of the Ohio country at Pickawillany. He had a trading post there and essentially got a price put on his head. So he had to fall back, and he fell back to Alwick up in Huntington, present-day Huntington County. So the Native Americans that ultimately settled beside George Crowan were refugees. They had been made refugees when the French took the point and started building Fort Duquesne, essentially. The Half-King, or Tanagrissan, and another leader's village, Queen Aliquippa, the Mingo Seneca, essentially were the only pro-British Native Americans in the colony. All the other natives from the Ohio country were leaning towards the French. And obviously the Delaware had memory of being displaced from eastern Pennsylvania, so they all had their reasons. But specifically the Mingo Seneca didn't like being displaced and sort of had an axe to grind with the French. And they became they could have become instrumental with Braddock's expedition, and then Braddock waved most of them off. A few went with Crowan and scouted for him. But it was very important. Both Britain and France knew that the Indian nations, who were caught in the middle of their colliding empires, were really key if they were going to make any progress.
Well, we have a large mountain pass behind us. It's been there for a long time. It's going to stay there for a long time. These were critically important for the Indians. How did they use this sort of natural superhighway?
War parties would have been coming from their village at Kittanning once they were emboldened in 1756 after Braddock's defeat. The natives would have used the valleys and also the gaps as their highways and choke points, essentially. Any movement that traders would have known these paths as well, but these war paths would have been heavily traveled and were able to, they could appear, do some reconnaissance, make a hit or a raid, and disappear again. And it was something that the frontier folks weren't really prepared to deal with. It was just luck of the draw who was going to get hit, essentially. I guess that you'd have to say that the cultural geography around here was dictated by the physical geography, right? These coves and these valleys are very isolated. So if you were a group of families trying to make a go of it here, you could be cut off from any sort of help.
Do we know the way that these paths went, and do any survive today?
There are a couple examples of original Indian paths available. If you take like some of the paths, like one of them, for example, is the Frankstown path. Was the path that actually Chief Shingas, who we'll be talking about here in a little bit, took from Kittanning to this direction. There's a couple of paths that exist. If you take a period map, John Hochwelder's map of Indian trails of the colony of Pennsylvania, you can take a geography, take a map, and you can place them together. But one specifically here, there's like the Tuscarora Trail, and supposedly that was the trail that the Tuscarora Indians took on their way up to New York to join the Iroquois. And that still exists. You can take that. You can go out for a Sunday and take a hike on that trail if you want to. But in some cases, these trails still do exist.
You mentioned an important name for us, Shingas. Who was he?
Shingas, Chief Shingas. He was a Delaware. As was mentioned earlier, the Half-King being around these parts. The Half King, he actually at a conference in 1752, Shingas was declared as king of the Delaware and was recognized formally by the colony of Pennsylvania. This, of course, was before hostilities began. He initially, as was mentioned previously here about Braddock sending away natives who would wish to join, Shingas, Chief Shingas was part of that as well. That he wanted to initially join this great effort by Braddock, and he was turned away. He was told that, as along with the other natives, that they really didn't have a place in the future for, in Braddock's opinion, in British North America. So they turned away and they sided with the French. After Braddock's defeat, it set loose any inhibition was taken away from these Indians that were allied with the French, such as Shingas. And the desire was there. There was no standing army in their way, and they were going to try to push the settlers off of their ancestral hunting grounds and push them as far east as they could get. If they could push them into the sea, that's what their end game was. And that's really what takes us to some of the events that transpired, such as the Big Cove, or the Great Cove Massacre, and what we have here, what we'll be talking about with the Fort McCord.
Now, we're here at McCord's fort. There's the monument. What did this fort look like, and what were these kind of forts used for?
These would have been structures that would have been looked like beefy cabins, or just log cabins that would have had protective slats to be able to fire from, be able to view from, and sometimes a palisade trench would have been dug, and poles or posts would have been erected around that area immediately around the structure, just to give you a perimeter of defense, so that when people are out in the fields and see hostile folks in the area, they can run to this and at least get behind cover. Essentially, these forts on the frontier, and even forts like Fort Shirley and Fort Littleton, were just palisade forts. They couldn't withstand cannon fire or anything like that. They were really to block small arms fire. And with these even smaller settler forts, you wouldn't expect a whole lot of labor to be put into the security of these things. But they would leave archaeological evidence. That's what I'm interested in, is the fact that you can find these builders' trenches and these foundations. Even if a structure didn't have a stone cellar and a stone foundation, you can still find evidence in the undisturbed subsoil that can, clue you in as to where these structures sat.
Shingas and his warriors will raid the Great Cove, and they'll raid here at McCord's fort. So could you take us through the events of what happened here and what that meant to the region?
Sure. What happened here at McCord's fort actually goes back 3 years prior. So this McCord's fort, April 1st, 1756, but 3 years before, in 1753, William McCord acquired this property through a Penn grant, through the William Penn, through his descendants in Philadelphia. And unbeknownst to him, maybe he knew, but unbeknownst to him, we'll say, there was a band of Delaware Indians that had used part of his property for better part of a couple hundred years as a place to hunt, as a place to set aside time. They had huts established here. And what happened, he did not want any parts of them being here. And part of it was as they were gone, he told them not to come back. He destroyed their huts. They come back the next season. Their huts are destroyed. They find that they build them again. He destroys them again. They are upset, and they flee west, most likely to the major Delaware town of Kittanning. That's in 1753. They vowed revenge and that they were going to get it one day, and that came to pass in 1756 when when after the Great Cove massacre, the Delawares, Shawnee, and their other native allies saw that the opportunity was there to do as they pleased. And I do not know, I don't believe it's written down who the actual, the Delaware, if there's not a name associated with the Delaware who was here at the McCord site, but somehow Shingas was told about what happened and they decided to act revenge. And so in March of 1756, latter part of March, 100 Indians they left the village of Katanning east, following the Frankstown path, through the cove that they had just destroyed the year before, and they get to the area here at the Kittatinny Mountains where you have what they refer to as the Yankee Pass, and there supposedly they watch McCord site for a day, maybe a few days before they decide to act. At 1 o'clock, just after lunchtime, on April 1st, 1756, most of the families that were here were in and about farming the area. Because of the attacks the year before, the families decided that the blockhouse such as McCord's would be a good place to stay at night. So what they did most likely, well, which is documented actually, they would go out during the day, farm, and in the evening come back, stay the night into the blockhouse. Well, most of them were out and about farming. 1 o'clock, Shingas and half of his band, so 50 of his warriors, come and they break through the palisade and start firing towards the blockhouse. They ignite arrows with fire and shoot flaming arrows at the house. In the upstairs is the women and children. There are 27 inhabitants. Jean Lowry, who we will talk about, her 5 children, they're in the upstairs. Jean Lowry's husband is below. He takes a rifle, fires, kills one of the Indians, charging. The next Indian kills him. Pretty soon, out of the 27, there are 18 killed and 9 that are taken prisoner, most of which were Jean Lowry and her 5 children. And also at this time, she is 5 or 6 months pregnant at the time. So that's what transpires that day. The other part of the band, who we'll talk about here, was Captain Jacobs, or named Tewae. He was sent out to also create some mayhem as well. But that's what happened on April 1st.
You said prisoners were taken. What fate would await a prisoner who was taken in a raid like that?
Well, typically, Fort McCord was kind of an anomaly with some of these attacks that happened on the frontier. The main objective was to take prisoners, mainly women and children, and bring them back into the Ohio country and adopt them into their tribal communities, replacing loved ones that had deceased previously, to bring their number up, because most of the tribal communities saw themselves as strength by numbers. It wasn't necessarily how much native blood you had in you. You could be a German or Scot-Irish. You would be fully adopted into that community. Now, the same fate, though, did not always stand true for males over the age of 16 or 18. Oftentimes were not viewed as an asset for their community and were seen as being kind of a bit on the cantankerous side and would cause other captives to flee their villages. So in this case, when you have the 9 captives, most of which were women and children, they fared okay, but with the killing of the 18, that is something that's a revenge act right there.
John, if you were to come to this site, which you have, What evidence would you see from that battle that day?
Well, like I said, the landowner Les is doing a great job in, first of all, he's an excellent metal detectorist. So one way you can find these sites, if you want to pinpoint the exact location and there's some question as to where it might be exactly in these fields, the first thing I've been doing is you can do two things. You can dig for it and expect to find it, or you can use a metal detector and start to establish some zones of period artifacts. So the things that are getting us very interested here are actually cluing in on 1755 buttons, buckles, anything that a blacksmith would create and that would, that's not post Revolutionary War farm equipment. You can tell when you're looking at a piece that's either, copper or hand wrought iron. There's a very good chance that it belongs to this time period. Also, pieces of tack, wagons, saddles, all those things there's all sorts of metal that falls off of them. So we're finding these clouds of, bridle tacks and buckles, and eventually you would look, we did this at Fort Necessity with a metal detecting session. We were trying to determine where the French firing line was by metal detecting and finding clusters of lead. So you can start to draw on a map where people are standing. So that's one thing you could potentially do, is start looking at where are your lead balls clustering, what's their condition, are they fired and mushroomed out, or are they unfired balls? There's all sorts of kind of diagnostic, almost forensic information in the material culture.
The fort was burned. You could tell that as well?
Indeed. There should be a palisade post or a foundation, charred wood, not more than a foot or two under the ground is very well preserved typically. Like at Fort Shirley, the posts are in the palisade trench once you get below the plow zone. And some of those are charred. So in fact, charring helps preserve wood archaeologically. So that would actually be a plus for us.
Now, far more than an attack on a fort or a blockhouse, this was really an attack on a community in a lot of ways. So how would a community react to something like this?
Well, they would react, which was typical of the time, is that they would try to assemble, figure out what happened, and then send an attack force to pursue. And that's exactly what happened here. So after the attack, so 1 o'clock was the attack on the 1st. Sometime, we don't know exactly when, but sometime later in that day, on April 1st, Alexander Culbertson, who was the captain of a relatively newly formed associated company of Pennsylvania provincials, he lives in present-day Letterkenny Township, which is about 10 to 12 miles away, and most of his men that make up his associated company live around, which back then they referred to as the Rocky Spring settlement, between there and present-day Shippensburg. Shippensburg is about 18 miles from there. So what happens is he works at assembling the company, and he acquires around 30 men. Most likely what happened is, by the time we're traveling an 18th century method of movement here, so it was most likely horseback. Somebody from the McCord settlement either heard, or somebody close by heard what was going on, sent somebody on a horse east to notify Culbertson, who was the local, basically a local commander in a sense, and to assemble the men. They came back to the Fort McCord site, most likely the next morning after they had assembled at Culbertson's. They came here on April 2nd. They would have seen the charred remains, seen if there was any survivors, talked to somebody who was maybe here at the time that witnessed it, and then they would have been hot on the trail of Shingus, his Delawares, and the captives. And we know that they went through they went as they came, which was through the Yankee Gap, over into Bear Valley, into Horse Valley, and west to a rendezvous point. But they would have been on hot pursuit by the 2nd.
Now this could be an important point. they didn't wait for the colony of Pennsylvania to respond militarily. Why was that?
Well, at this point, the colony of Pennsylvania, which most part Quaker government at the time, is still weighing the option of whether or not this is a real war or not, whether or not these threats are authentic, and they don't want to get behind funding a standing army. You have to remember, up to this point, up to the French and Indian War, there were no wars in Pennsylvania as a colony. The only thing that there was basically border disputes between neighboring colonies. So what really transpires is that you're not going to get any help from the city of brotherly love here. In this case, you have to go out on your own, and so that's why you start to see associated companies, not militias, as other colonies have. Not militias. Militias were mainly paid for and supplied by the colony. In this case, you have local civilians that take arms themselves and form together to protect their own.
I've used this comparison before. I'll put it to the test. Is this sort of like a volunteer fire company in a way?
You got it. This is Culbertson's volunteer brigade in that way. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so they're on the move. What are they going to do?
Well, they're gonna retrace Shingus's steps. Like I mentioned before, they know the trails. The trails are pretty recognizable. They're passes of least resistance through the mountains. There's no roads. There's no highways at that time. These are the roads and highways. There are traders that use certain paths. So it's not a totally unknown thing of how did these Indians get here and how did they go? It's pretty apparent. But what the advantage that the Indians have, even though they're being slowed by Jean Lowry, who's 5 or 6 months pregnant, and captives, is that the Indians have a long standing of wanting to move as fast as you can. After they hit, they move as fast as they can. That first 24 hours, they move without stopping until they get to the rendezvous point. Culbertson and his men know this, but they still tread cautiously, and they move. There is an account that says that Culbertson they travel overnight, which would be into April 3rd, which is a Saturday, and they get to Fort Littleton most likely sometime in the morning, early morning, if not right at the break of dawn. They get to Fort Littleton, and they come upon Fort Littleton and find out that the crew there under Captain Hans Hamilton has no clue that there was even an attack at Fort McCord. Again, there's no cell phones, there's no direct dialing in here on this type of thing. They were completely unaware that there were French allied Delaware Indians out there. And so Culbertson and his men, they tell him what happened. His 30 men are there. Captain Hamilton agrees to supply Culbertson's men with roughly 18 to 20 additional. So Culbertson's force swells to 50.
We have an Indian force unaware that this group of frontiersmen are coming toward them. Take us through the Battle of Sideling Hill.
Okay. So one of the things I failed to mention is that the distance, like I mentioned, that Culbertson was about 10 to 12 miles from the Fort McCord site. From Fort McCord, now not driving, but travel distance through trails, you're about 20 to 25 miles walking distance to Fort Littleton. Once they got to Fort Littleton and they found out that the crew there did not know what was going on, their number swelled to 50, they then decided that, well, this Indian, they were seeing traces of Shingus and his men and his warriors, but they were not quite sure still where they were. They figured that they weren't any farther south because the crew at Fort Littleton did not see them pass by. And they figured that they wouldn't go farther north than Fort Shirley that was manned by Captain Mercer to the north. So that they knew that Shingas and his warriors had to be somewhere in between. So what they decided to do is that if you look at where Fort Littleton is on the map today, you can see that there's a little creek that runs by there called the Little Ogwick. And what they do is that they decide on the 3rd, this is still the 3rd, on Saturday, they decide to debark from the fort, travel north on the Little Ogwick, which is a bit windy, not as windy as the Conicajig here, but it's windy. And they go 5 miles up the creek where they come to the confluence of the Little Ogwick and the Sideling Hill Creek. That's in present-day Maddinsville, Pennsylvania. Now, what I'm about to get into is the site itself has never been dug, but a lot of the sources indicate just on geography that it's most likely in Maddinsville and the confluence of these two creeks. So with that said, Culbertson and his men, they arrive there sometime in the evening on the 3rd, and they see fires in the distance. They come to a rocky cliff that's at the bend of the Sideling Hill Creek, and as a scout approached this cliff, they see the fires of Shingas, his warriors, and the captives camped on the other side of the creek in a bend. They had located Shingas. Culbertson and his men decide to retreat back for the evening, camp out and wait for morning to perform an attack at dawn, which if you know anything about European tactics, that is perfect for a tactician of the 18th century. Assemble, get somewhat of a night's rest, attack in the morning, which is what they did. They forded down an area today referred to as Anderson's Grove. It's a low marshy area that is at the point of the confluence of the creeks. They go to cross the creeks, catching Shingas and his men and the captives completely by surprise. Shingas and his warriors flee, leaving arms and captives behind. There is an elation of joy by Jean Lowry, as she describes a few years later when she published her memoirs in 1760, about the elation of seeing her neighbors come there to her rescue. She embraced them, her children, some of the others from the Fort McCord site. They go to a hill, they rendezvous there for a brief moment until Chief Shingas' second in command, Captain Jacobs, or Tewa, arrives at the rendezvous point that him and Shingas had decided on previously. To Captain Jacobs' surprise, he gets there and finds Shingas gone, but he finds Culbertson and his men. Captain Jacobs immediately goes to form a semicircle, which is the typical Indian method of tactical combat, and attack Culbertson and his men, who are completely not expecting this. They had thought that they had won the day. At this point, with arms still on the field, Shingas and his warriors come back onto the scene, pick up their arms, and totally encircle Culbertson, his men, and the captives. Very, very difficult position for Culbertson. Out of Culbertson's roughly 50 men, they're outnumbered almost 2 to 1 by Shingas and Captain Jacobs and their warriors. There's a battle that lasts for 2.5 hours. One of the survivors, a private from Fort Littleton, notes later that he set his watch at the beginning of the attack, so between 2 and 2.5 hours. There are references to all the men firing, going through all their ammunition, which they reference as being 24 rounds. They have to break through the encirclement and flee towards the direction and flee south towards Fort Littleton. They leave roughly 18, there's 18 dead. Well, they leave 18 on the battlefield, and there are roughly 12 to 14 wounded that flee back to Fort Littleton. One of the wounded is the doctor, the only doctor at Fort Littleton, was one of the wounded ones there. And also, who was killed in the battle was Captain Culbertson was killed during the on the scene when Captain Jacobs shows up. The only native fatalities, Gene Lowry writes about one of the Indians was killed and one wounded during the first stage of the battle. The second stage, we do not know how many Indians are killed. There's an Indian ally who is located at Fort Littleton, who after the battle comes back with a scalp and claims it was Captain Jacobs' scalp. Well, a few months later, we find out that it's not Captain Jacobs' scalp because he's still out there terrorizing. There are an express sent from Fort Littleton once the men return about this disastrous defeat to Fort Shirley. They want to try to acquire the services of Dr. U. Mercer, who is the captain at Fort Shirley as well, to come there and assist. He can't leave right away because of the threat of the 100 natives running about. So as you can see, it really this action really sets this area on its ear per se.
Why do you think the Indians had so much success? Because the men of Cumberland County were certainly motivated. They seemed to be prepared. They were there the night before. What do you think was the biggest difference maker?
The surprise. They had underestimated the native contingent that was there. You figure they arrived there, they scope it out, battle plan on the 3rd. They come down the morning of the 4th, which was a Sunday, by the way. That Gene Lowry writes about it being the Sabbath day. That didn't have any bearing on this on the outcome. But what happens is that they end up underestimating their foe. And you can imagine the jubilation. It would have been like Culbertson and his men. They travel almost 30 miles. They get there. They kill one Indian. They wound one. None of their men are injured at all. It looks like a complete success, and it goes completely 180 with being surrounded and almost completely annihilated by Captain Jacobs and his force, who were coming back to rendezvous with Shingas.
A lot of us are used to battles being very neat as far as when they begin, when they end. This battle, no such luck. There is some controversy about the date of the event. Could we talk about that?
Yes, there's a couple of contemporary sources from the period, dated letters that say that list April 2nd as the date, and then there are some that list April 4th as the date. My opinion is that it was the 4th. I don't see how you could have Culbertson and his men receive word on the 1st, assemble on the 1st, march 30 miles over the 1st and into the 2nd, get to Fort Littleton, acquire the additional manpower, and then get to the location and battle for 2.5 hours. I don't see how that's possible in a little over a 24-hour period. What is possible is April 4th, and as I mentioned before, is that Gene Lowry, her account on this is published in 1760 in Philadelphia after her return. And she writes that it happened on the Sabbath day, on the 5th of April. But if you do your homework and look back into the calendar of what April 4th 1756 was, is that it was a Sunday. So she was mostly mistaken on the 5th, but saying the Sabbath day, she would have remembered what day that was. She knew in her accounts that they had crossed 2 mountains, that they were on the run for 3 days. So putting it on the 4th makes a lot of sense. You also have Captain Hans Hamilton. He writes a letter to either Fort Shirley or to the governor of, or by way of the or to the governor of Pennsylvania through by way of Fort Shirley, that about the account, and this was done at 8 o'clock in the evening at Fort Littleton, and it's written on the 4th, and he writes about the distress and about they feared that their doctor was killed during the attack, which their doctor, Jameson was his name, Ensign Jameson. He ends up, he was left on the battlefield for dead, but then two days later he finds his way back to Fort Littleton. So you have some accounts, you have a number of accounts there that really lean towards the 4th as being the probable date of the battle.
John, there's some mystery regarding where this battle happened. In your opinion, do you believe this site could be positively identified through archaeological tactics we have today?
It is possible because, you know, certainly it's a chance encounter. There's no structure or anything to focus our attention there. What you're going to need to find are artifacts, and if you just mentioned that, say, 50 men have 24 rounds and expended all of them, that's how much lead you have out there to start finding these clusters of lead, essentially. That's how you would prove it on the ground, but you would also have to use what we know from the written record to put that geography together of the bend of the river and the opposite bank, and but to honest to God say it's the definite location, I would say, clusters of lead balls, military, weaponry, pieces of gun parts, buttons. These wouldn't have been British regulars, so you're not going to find a bunch of standardized British buttons around, but you would certainly find personal effects and personal adornment. It's going to be looking for a needle in a haystack at that point, though. It's hard enough to find McCord's fort, and there was a structure and a palisade here.
How does the colony of Pennsylvania respond to this? This seems like a traumatic event.
It is a traumatic event. One of the things I didn't mention is that there was Culbertson and his men. There were 50 men, and there were roughly about 27 to 30 casualties in this event, and it was a very high casualty rate for a battle of the period. About over 60% of the men that were involved, that were Culbertson's force, and the Pennsylvanians located at Fort Littleton, killed or wounded. Once word got back to Philadelphia about what was going on, about the combined tragedy of both McCord and the Sideling Hill battle, this was the breaking point for the colony in the way of supplying military action. This was not seen anymore as just being maybe a war or something that's just going to pass. This was something that was not going to go away unless there was some serious infrastructure put in place, and that's what you start to see. There are different episodes of people going to Philadelphia with bodies from different accounts, bodies of deceased loved ones from Indian attacks, that bring them to Philadelphia for the people to finally see that this is really happening. Because there's a bit of naivete from the Quaker Assembly that these Indians that have been allied and have been part of William Penn's dream for this peaceful kingdom could not be doing such horrible acts, which they soon saw was their eyes were soon opened. So you started to see the assembling of 3 companies of Pennsylvania battalions. There are hundreds of men that come and volunteer to extend their services into a paid, to be paid by the colony, outfitted by the colony, which then it ends up turning into a full British military expedition and the Forbes campaign, which the Forbes campaign comes again, it comes back through this area that we're located in Fort McCord. So this area is traversed by activities before, during, and after during the French and Indian War period.
What do we think the overall legacy of this event should be? What's the takeaway?
The takeaway is that the event itself really changed. It really changed the colony of Pennsylvania. It really brought the colony into play with the other colonies that are that have been in a conflict with the Empire of France for years, and with enemy Indians for years. And so finally got Pennsylvania into, so there were certain actors in Pennsylvania at the time, like Benjamin Franklin, who was trying for a couple years up to that point to get Pennsylvania to do something about not having a defense, about not having any force. And that changed after what transpired at McCord and Sideling Hill.
Also, the fact that you had a few captives that were dragged all the way back to Katanning from McCord. 4 months later, you have Fort Granville being taken, and John Armstrong's brother is killed there. And John Armstrong, who eventually sets off on the Katanning expedition, provided this one pulse from the colony to kind of make an impression on the natives and to sort of make them a little more shy about, or at least that was the hope, to make them think twice about running so many raids. That was a very costly mission. The Katanning expedition was successful, but they lost lots and lots of folks, and Pennsylvania wasn't going to be able to keep throwing a bunch of those operations towards the west. So the new model became a protected advance of the Forbes Road. But it's really neat to track these individuals, through history and across the cultural landscape here, and knit it together. And it really takes, there's a lot to consider. So between the material evidence and the written record, I think there's a lot of information exchange, and also interdisciplinary work that kind of carries us forward in understanding these events.
On that note, I'd like to thank my guests for joining us today. Remember to pick up a copy of our new guidebook, Battlefield Pennsylvania, written by yours truly, available now. As always, if you have questions about today's episode or recommendations for future episodes, please visit our website at pcntv.com. For everybody here at Battlefield Pennsylvania, I'm Brady Crytzer saying so long.